thank you for giving up your Saturdays for another Zoom session or online kind of learning. It's been, I don't think anyone would have thought when we started doing some of these online sessions last April and May that we'd still be in this a year down the line, but it's good to see some familiar faces and still people wanting to get involved in coach development. And I think it's something quite vital right at this moment, because there finally is light at the end of the tunnel, and it's looking likely that clubs and tracks are going to be coming back online within the next few weeks. So that's where this event group breakout initially started as a discussion around, I think Zoe coined the thing, how to get a great start. So I will get into some of that stuff, but I think we also looked at it as a great chance to get some thought processes and discussions around return to training for youth athletes, and specifically returning to track training as well. Because I think over the coming weeks, it's going to be a vital area to think about in terms of getting athletes back onto tracks in a safe manner, and making sure that kind of their health and well-being is the most important thing. So as I said, yeah, hold on, slides, there we go. So yeah, the kind of the theme of this session has taken a slight variation, because as I said, I thought it was a good time to look at firstly touching on returning to that specific track training, looking at areas we should all consider as coaches prior to athletes getting back on track, and then once they are back on track, certain risks to look out for, specific things that we need to kind of be aware of that could be caused by that kind of returning to track. Once we've gone through some of that, and that is literally going to be me sharing my ideas and my thought processes that I've gone through over the last few weeks, because luckily over the last few weeks, I've actually had athletes who've been given kind of elite dispensation late through this situation that have been running on hills and grass and road, and now have started coming back onto the track. So I can give you some ideas around what has happened with them, what we specified, what we looked at, and then sort of how they responded to some of those kind of new environments that they hadn't been exposed to for a while. And then we're going to look at how to get a great start. And that specifically for me today in this kind of youth development area is starting to look at variations of positions and how we progress those positions to eventually getting into blocks. It's something I see quite often, and probably something we've all seen, is young kids come to the track, and the first things, if they want to do sprints, is that their parents buy them a set of starting blocks, even though they might be 11 or 12 and they can't even support their own body weight. But straight away we chuck them into blocks because that's what we've got to do in kind of competitive environments. But is that the right thing to do? And how can we actually progress it to the point where they are ready to get into blocks and they know exactly what they're actually trying to do when they do use those blocks? So we'll be looking at some of the variations of start positions and how the progressions for those kind of can change. So, okay, starting with sort of that returning to the track and things to consider prior to athletes coming back on track. So I don't know if by a show of hands or anything like that, has any track training started for any of your younger athletes yet? No, shaking heads. That's good. So we're in this position now where in the coming weeks, you're going to have to start writing your session programs and things like that. So just things to consider before you start kind of putting any of those programs together. So the first thing would be, I would make contact with, if you haven't already, make contact with all of the people that you coach and work with to try and find out if they've been able to do any training during this period of time. You might already be in contact with them around this. If they've been able to do any training, what training they have been doing, the surfaces that they've been running on, what kind of footwear are they using? Have they been able to run in spikes on grass, or are they just in trainers? Some of the other things to possibly consider are things like isolated training. Have they been able to, I know probably may have been a little bit against the rules, but had they been able to meet up with some friends to do some sessions in parks or whatever or has all of their training been completely isolated? So all of a sudden, when you change that environment and they come back into a big group, how is that going to interact with the fact that they've been isolated for so long? So have a think about that. And then the big thing for youth development is to make sure you consider that excitement around that returning to the track. Because if you leave it up to the young kids and things like that, they are going to want to do everything. They are going to want to come to the track that first session, put their spikes on, get into blocks and run absolutely flat out. Like, that excitement around what they're going to be doing is just incredible. So make sure you have that as an understanding and awareness prior to kind of even getting to the track, because it is going to be very exciting for everyone. And that's where you've got to be very, very cautious in some areas to not try and do too much too soon. So in terms of those, has anyone in just going through those things quickly, has anyone else got any ideas as to other potential considerations to look at before you would actually get to the track? No, I think I tried to cover off on kind of as many bases as I could there. So yeah, just I would say look at that and see how much all of that is very relevant. I think the big one that kind of gets washed over in this situation is going to be something to do with that isolation. I was able to see my niece for the first time in a long time, and she's a 14-year-old girl, and she's found the isolation as a child quite hard. So I think it's something to be aware of as kids get back into it, to just look out for it. Are they isolating themselves within the session, just to get back to that interaction and learning how to interact with kids again, because I think that might be a big thing that we have to look out for. Okay, once we're at the track then, for me, when I started back with the athletes, I took the decision to only change one variable at a time. So the first variable that changed was that they were back on track. So instantly, I didn't let the first session, I didn't let them run in spikes, I didn't let them run too fast, all of these things, because they'd been training pretty much full time up until then. But as soon as you change the surface that you're running on, there is the potential risk for any kind of soft tissue injury. So the first introduction change that came for that first session was that just they were running on track, because naturally the way tracks are, they're going to run faster than they have been running on road and on grass anyway. So you have to see how the body responds first and foremost to that change in exposure to the track environment. The next thing then that I introduced was spikes. And when I say I introduced this, I introduced it for a part of a session. I didn't allow the athlete then to do the entire session with spikes on. Say the session that we had was 3 sets of 360s. The athlete did set 1 in flats, they did set 2 in spikes, and then they went back into their trainers for the last set. So again, it's just thinking about how often are we introducing the spiked element, because especially with youth development athletes, those kids, they're gonna want to put their spikes on. They really are. But if they haven't been in spikes for potentially 9-10 months, you have to be very, very careful with how much work they're doing in those spikes. I'll get onto some of the risks later, but that's definitely an area that you should think about, is how much running they're going to be doing in spikes. The next thing we started to change was the intensity. As I said, as soon as the athletes are back on track, naturally the intensity is going to creep up. So you don't necessarily need to program sessions where they're running flat out to start with, because they're going to want to run faster. So I gradually progressed the intensity within the training sessions just to allow their body to adapt to that extra speed. I was very lucky with the athletes that I work with. During the times that they were training, we were able to monitor speeds that they were running at, so that as they got back on track, I was able to then guide the speed and progress that. Kids, by their nature and the excitement, they're just going to want to run fast. They're going to want to sprint. So it's just making sure that we're aware of that, and then how quickly you really want to push that kind of envelope of the speed. Frequency. So when I say frequency, what I mean by that is the frequency of the training stimulus. So have they been doing 1 session, 2 sessions a week in lockdown, and then all of a sudden there's 3 track evenings that they can go to, and they go from training once or twice a week to 3 times a week on track. So make sure you have that as an awareness of, yeah, what is the big change as we go through here. And if you jump from minimal training to a lot of training, then we're putting them at risk. So I would just be aware, don't be afraid of keeping in the first week maybe only one track session, just to see how they respond to that. In week 2, then potentially build that to 2 sessions if they respond well. By week 3, you might be able to get back up to 3 sessions a week on track, or keeping it at 2 on track and keeping 1 on grass, whatever it be. But I would be very, very kind of cautious around jumping straight back into doing 2 to 3 track sessions in the first week of training. Volume within the session. So again, all of this links back to how much they've been able to do prior to coming back to the session. So if your old sessions take an acceleration workout, if you used to do, I don't know, something like 3 times 20 meters, 3 times 30 meters, 3 times 40 meters, if they were able to do that when they've been training a lot, it might be a case of just dropping that volume down a fraction, halving the volume of track exposure to start with, just to make sure we're allowing that adaptation to take place and just getting their body again used to that extra stimulus. And then also the competitive situations. They're kids, they're going to want to run against each other, they're going to want to race that kind of environment, running against their friends. If they have been doing everything on their own, I would say the competitive type of training should probably be the last stimulus that should be brought in. Make sure they're able to run in spikes, make sure they're able to run fast, make sure they're moving well, and then finally I would bring in that competitive nature, because instantly, as soon as they start running against their friends, they're going to go faster again. And if they haven't done all of those things to allow them to get to that point, there's that potential risk factor. And then at the bottom there, I've put kind of make each track session count. I wouldn't just get back onto the track for the sake of it. If there is a bit of work capacity type training that you do, or the speed endurance, special endurance type stuff, the one thing that lockdown has taught us is that stuff doesn't have to be done on the track all the time. So if we're bringing in the speed work on track and you're bringing in the spikes work on track, that other stuff potentially could be done on grass, just to allow, so we're not overloading the body of the athlete as we kind of build back into this full training volume and full training load. Does that kind of make sense to everyone as a progression? Yeah. Has anyone got any thoughts on any of that, in terms of had you guys kind of thought around these progressions before you start getting the athletes back onto the track?
I think, Matt, that we'll possibly be a lot more careful this time around. When we got back onto track after the last lockdown, we fortunately had a few weeks with the athletes on grass before we progressed onto the track, where we were allowed to travel and work with the athletes. So when we got them onto the track, it wasn't as if we were seeing them brand new,
Yeah.
but I still think we all got a little bit too excited that we were back on track. So it'll be kind of a little bit more careful this time round. It's because we'd seen them and we could see that they were in a pretty good state and they had been doing the training. We got perhaps a little bit overexcited with the track.
Yeah, it's, as you say, there was slight variations in previous lockdowns where there was more accessibility to drive to parks and do sessions, as you say, on grass. We haven't had that this time. And also this one seems to have been quite significant in terms of its time length. And then also through the winter with the grass, they probably won't have been able to run as fast on boggy Welsh rugby pitches during the winter as they were able to during the summer. So yeah, I think it's definitely something to bear in mind around that kind of that natural intensity is just going to jump up notches as soon as they get back onto the track. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think what we find as well, Matt, is that on the first lockdown during the summer months, it was a lot easier to control what the athletes were doing during lockdown. But what I've certainly noticed this winter, it's been extremely difficult. Yeah. So we've got a group of athletes in the sprint group who are going to be all at different types of fitness levels, etc. Unfortunately, I've lost 4 athletes to injury because of running on the roads, running in car parks. Unfortunately, I've got one 17-year-old athlete who is going to require career-threatening surgery because running on concrete, she's torn the articular cartilage in the back of the knee. So it's all of those factors that come into play. Certainly when they get back on track this time, it's going to be a lot more difficult to manage, I think, in terms of seeing where everybody is on an individual basis.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't agree more with that, Phil. It's, as you say, you're going to be having, if you coach a group of 10, 12, 15 youngsters, they're all going to be so varied in what they've been able to do and where they're at when they come back. And it's going to be a tricky situation managing those sessions as coaches to give the athletes that have been able to do quite a lot what they need, and then those athletes that haven't been able to do as much, kind of gradually building those up. But yeah, I think just having that mindset around some of these areas to focus on before we get back into those environments is going to be a great one, because yeah, we all know the exuberance of youth, and they're just gonna want it. I saw it even with the 20, 21, 22-year-olds that I coached, that like trying to tell them that first week back they're not going to be running in spikes was like, it wasn't an easy conversation to have. They want to get back onto the track and put their spikes on straight away. And these are smart people who've studied sports studies that know the risks as well. And we're still having to have those conversations. So yeah, it's been a tricky one, but I think as long as we're aware of the risks of coming back onto a track, and we can just gradually progress that exposure, then I think the kids will be in a good place. One thing I think maybe to convey to the young athletes as they come back as well, which might help in terms of that progressive return, is we're having discussions around the competitive program that obviously in England, and we're now starting to put out some dates of competitions. What we're actually going to look at doing, though, is we're going to look at putting on more competitions in July, August, and even into September of this year, so that we actually push back the season, or the traditional season, a little bit, to allow people more time to prepare for that competition arena. So you can be kind of open with the athletes that will be happening. So there will be, similar to some of the pilot events that we ran in August of last year, we'll do the same thing this year and have more competitions for the young ones later into July, August and September, just so that no one feels they have to rush to get back to competing. It's going to be a bit of a risk. So that's something that we can talk to them about as well.
Matt?
Yes.
I know you've released some dates, was it today or yesterday?
Yeah.
So the English champs are on the 7th and 8th, and the Welsh champs are the week before. Is that set in stone now, the Welsh champs? Because only 7 days recovery between.
Sorry,
Well,
I haven't actually seen that. So
yeah, British champs are 7th and 8th. So they are August, and Welsh champs have come out now as being the 1st. So I'm just mindful that it's obviously 7 days. Usually there's about 14 days between the two of them in there.
Yeah, right. Again, with that, I think at that moment now, because a lot of the home nations are looking at putting more competitions later in the year, we have to put it, I think it's about 10 days, 2 weeks prior to the Manchester International, because I think we might be using the Welsh Championships as a selection event for that.
So this is the junior Welsh now, mine on the senior, I mean, yeah.
Sorry, yes. And the English Junior Championships on the 7th and 8th as well.
Because the seniors are the week after, so the seniors, I believe, are the 14th, 15th. So juniors the week before, but the British are in the middle of the juniors and the seniors. And
is that the British under-17 championship?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So all the junior events.
I'll raise that in the competitions department and just check if that is, as you say, finalised.
Yeah. I was just wondering, was it because of COVID and they might just be, I don't know, might just be seeded races, so there'll be less, it won't be rounds, it'll be heat and final, or would it be, you know what I mean? Is it going to be less, you know?
Potentially, yes, but there's still lots of unknowns with the competition world at the moment in terms of how many athletes will be allowed at the venue. Rules in England are different from rules in Wales. It seems like there'll be larger numbers in the competitions in England from the guidance currently than we're allowed in Wales. But I would suspect that there'll be slightly lower numbers in both events than we've had historically. So yeah, I think it's something that we can make sure that we check and get that information out to you guys.
Because obviously we're happy for it, you know, to be the week before the British, because obviously, you know, it's the same kind of periodization thing, but it's just 7 days is close, isn't it?
Yeah, it is close, and I think the problem is, as I said, because all of the home nations are looking at putting more competitions later in the year, the calendar then with the junior events and the senior events does start becoming quite saturated, and it's almost just trying to find points where they can fit into the program.
Yeah. Because we spoke to UK athletics about the junior champs being, and that's set 7th and 8th. So it is. So
the English one will be.
Sorry,
yes.
The
English one will be. It's definitely something I can raise as a point of, in terms of, is it too close to have two junior championships back-to-back weekends?
That would be great, because I'm just thinking recovery, and then there'll be no room for training before it. Yeah, I'll leave that with you.
I'll make a note and speak to Rhea about that. But thank you for letting me know. Cool. Anything else quickly before we move on then? No. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yes. Some of the I didn't even get into some of the risk things to look out for specifically, and this is off some of my experiences, not just during this lockdown, but previous ones, but also just after kind of that end of season break when athletes come back into track training, just certain things to be aware of. And I think this one has highlighted it more. So again, the easiest way of finding these things out is always just having good communication with the athletes that you're working with. Ask them how they're feeling, ask them. And it's not just a case of going, how are you feeling? Because you know what kids' kind of communication skills are like. You'll just get, or okay, back. Ask them specific kind of questions around, have you got any specific areas of tightness or soreness after the second track session? I would look out for specific tightnesses in the lower limb area. So definitely anything around calves, shins, Achilles. And specifically, one thing we found with some of the sort of 18, 19, 20-year-olds when they got back into spikes for the first time was that they were getting a lot more awareness in their feet, because they hadn't been in spikes potentially for sort of 7-8 months. Just around the plantar fascia was just getting a little bit tight and a little bit sore. So I'd make sure we ask those questions. We all know with the young kids that some of them are predisposed to getting sort of that shin tightness, turning into the shin splints. So just making sure that their calves are not getting too tight, which will be pulling on that sheath and causing those shin irritations as we come back onto the track. Because the intensity of the training is going to be picking up so much, look out for extra fatigue, the body language of the athletes. Are they just looking generally more tired than we're used to seeing them, to allow them to do the training that we want them to do? And then also, I think a big one, like we touched on earlier, is just be aware of those interactions within the group. Look out for are one or two of them kind of isolating themselves away from the others, because I think, I mean, Lynn's probably in a much better place to talk about this than me, but I think kids not kind of socially interacting for 8, 9, 10 months is going to have big long-term effects on how they do start interacting when they come back. And the majority of them will probably be fine, but there will probably be 1 or 2 that will struggle with that reintegration into those kind of group environments. Yeah, Lynn, I don't know if you've seen anything like that when the kids have come back to school.
We've been on, since they've come back, we've been on several kind of head teacher seminars and discussion groups and all kinds of things. And everybody says exactly the same thing, that they're finding it really difficult to interact again as a group, and there seems to be a lot more emotion being thrown around and a lot more falling out on the playground in general. In general across Wales, throughout South and North Wales, where different groups of teachers have met up and discussed the next steps forward for education. So I'm assuming it's going to be the same thing, you know, with the next steps forward in sport as well, to be aware of those. The children are carrying a lot more emotional baggage than what they may have before. Especially the ones that, you know, are not particularly brilliant at interacting in the first place. They may have withdrawn even further back into their shells.
Yeah, and I just think it's something that for us as coaches, ultimately we're in a privileged position to try and help these young people. It's just something for us to be aware of and make sure we keep an eye out for with how they're interacting, and just again with that, there's no right or wrong in terms of how we kind of deal with that, but it's just something then that potentially can talk to their parents around, and get ideas on how better to interact with them and try and integrate them back. But I'm sure you'll all do a great job of that. But also for us as coaches, as we start interacting together, make sure we're looking out for each other. Ask the coaches, how are you doing with things? Because I'll hold my hands up, like, I've hated it. I've really struggled this last sort of 8-9 months, and it's only been the fact that I've been lucky that we've had some elite dispensation to have some actual interaction with the athletes, that without that kind of human interaction, I think I would have been in a pretty bad place. So make sure you look out for your fellow coaches and just ask each other, and just have a little chat. Make time to have a coffee at the end of a session once we're allowed to, and just have a chat and ask how people's lives are getting on. So I think we've got a duty of care for each other as much as for the athletes that we work with. Okay, all right, we've done all that now. Let's get into some of the actual specific stuff, because we've only got about 15 minutes left of this session before we have a little break before the last one. So the idea around this session now is talking about some of the variant start positions and what progressions they're going to be. Now, all of you guys are good coaches. You're working well your athletes. And I don't want this to be a suck eggs kind of thing, teaching you or talking about things that you know all about. It's more about trying to understand why some of these positions and progressions can be beneficial. Maybe when in the program and when in the year they're also good to use, and just a couple of kind of technical things to specifically look at when we do some of these shapes, as was talked about in the previous thing, looking out for shapes, and just maybe getting a bit more understanding of why we do a certain position, and how that helps progress to the next one. So for me, I see sort of the 5-step development to be able to get a young athlete into blocks safely, and so that they know what they're doing. I kind of break it down into 5 different kind of positions. The first one I would call is a drop-in. And I've got videos of all of these that we can actually have a look at and look at what that movement pattern should look like. A drop-in essentially is kind of like a rolling start where they'll take a couple of steps and just push off. The next one would be what I call a rollover. So it's a static position where they're just kind of crouching down, but they don't put their hands on the floor, and they'll just again fall and push. Third one would be that tripod position, which is the one we tend to see in relays. I think an underutilized start position that we can have for young athletes is a 4-point start, because essentially it mimics the position they're going to be in the blocks, and it allows them to start, one, holding their body weight, learning how that position should feel, and learning how to push from that position before we actually introduce the block plates. And I've put my favorite teacher there, little Mr. Yoda, because the one thing as coaches, ultimately we're teachers as well. And we should always be able to teach the athlete the movement pattern that we want to try and help develop. I think there's much more of a thirst now within the coaches who are developing themselves for some actual technical knowledge. I think there was in some of the olden programs within Britain with the very much long to short kind of training styles, I think there was a lot more kind of just training that went on as opposed to actual coaching. And I think by getting into some of the detail with these things, it actually allows us to coach. And that's the fun part of what we do, is actually helping an athlete develop their movement patterns and seeing them improve with things. So yeah, just the one thing I got told when I started coaching was just don't be afraid to get stuck in, learn about the movements, get stuck in and try and teach them. Try and find creative ways to teach the movement pattern that we actually want to get out. So as I said, I'm not going to go in, I haven't got like bullet point things of every single one. I'm going to put a video of an athlete executing the movement. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of kind of areas that I like to see in this movement. And then how then that works in the progression to the next one. So the first one, and I'll play the video a few times, is what I would call a drop-in. So this for me is just the athlete takes a couple of steps to get going, and then they'll start really pushing off of a step. I'll play that again if my cursor starts working. There he is. Again, we can see the athlete walking, starting to skip, and then starting to push. And one of the things for me where I really like a drop-ins acceleration, which I think will help some of the younger athletes, is it creates a bit of momentum before they start pushing. What we see sometimes with youth athletes is that they struggle to really produce force from a static position. Once they get going after steps 1 and 2, then they can start really kind of like putting a bit of force down. And what this does is it recreates that feeling where they've created a bit of momentum, they've allowed the body to fall, and then they can start pushing. Has anybody got any thoughts or questions on that kind of movement? Has everybody used the drop in? Yeah?
Yeah.
Good. That's nice. And for me, the drop in, I would use specifically at the start of winter quite often. If an athlete hasn't been doing a lot of acceleration work for a while, we're just building training back up again. At the start of winter, in that first block or the first couple of blocks, I really find that that kind of movement pattern is something that gets the athlete feeling how to accelerate again, how to project their body in space, because they've fallen forward and allowed that movement and momentum to create something for them to push off. So I think that's where I would use it. And then also at the start of a training session. So maybe the athlete will have done a run in flats, they put their spikes on. A drop in is just a good movement pattern to get the body firing, get the muscles firing, get everything warmed up. Again, just a nice point to start that kind of movement. This is a rollover position for me. Now the things that I see quite a lot when an athlete does a rollover position is we see a lot of forced movement with the arms. I've seen some people do it where they almost have their arms in a fixed kind of position by their sides. And what I see with that is it creates quite a lot of tension in the athlete. So for me, I like to see a relaxed position where they're just allowing the arms to fall to the shoulders, the neck, and everything around the head then is in a relaxed state for them to allow them to express a lot of force. And also what I like with a rollover, if you watch Hannah with this, is she'll rock back before she then transfers her weight forward to push. So if you, again, I'll play this a few times. If you just watch out to see her in a nice relaxed position, and then she'll rock back before she pushes forward. Yeah, I'll play that again. I don't know why every time the cursor just disappears. If you see, so she gets down into a nice relaxed position. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to pause it. You can see there she's in a relaxed position, and that's where she's just transferred her weight back, which then she can transfer her weight forward and push off. Does that make sense? Yeah. Has anybody used these where they've tried doing it from a bit of a kind of a fixed position? Yeah. And has anybody, and then have you actually tried it where you've actively cued maybe an athlete to try and rock back to allow them to fall and transfer that weight? Something you see quite a lot with developing athletes and those young kind of 12, 13, 14-year-olds, even up to 17, is those first 4 or 5 steps, really allowing that forward projection. They like to just stand up and run. It's a lot of that road run. If any of you have been on some of the other presentations I've done, I liken it to the road runner where you just see the legs spinning and then they take off. So I think this rollover and this transfer of weight is a really good one to allow athletes to start feeling that body shape falling forward and then allowing them to actually project forward through acceleration. Is everybody seeing what I'm saying there? Yeah, with just that. And it's only a very small movement. You're not kind of like leaning and rocking right back. It's just a little movement back to allow that athlete to fall and push. And it's definitely something that I think younger athletes will relate to because they'll be able to feel that position of falling. And then the next step is overcoming the fear, because that's one of the other big things. The reason they like to stand up is because there's a fear of falling as they're in acceleration. This movement kind of forces them into that position, and they have to work out then how to get out of it. So the third one we see is the tripod. Again, I'll put this through. Now, the great thing about the tripod is the first one we can do where all of a sudden we're actually in a crouched position down towards the floor. We're starting to replicate an on your marks and then a set position. I had to film this one twice with Hannah because she actually forgot what her starting leg was, and she put her same hand down. So even with older athletes who've been to quite high level championships, they can still forget certain things. So I'll play it through a couple of times just to watch it, and then we can kind of talk around, or I'll talk around some of the things we want to look for. Yeah. Okay, I'll try and pause it where. Okay, so here in this start position, if you haven't used the tripod before or you're not sure about it, you'd have your opposite hand on the floor to whatever your stance leg is or your first leg. And you want to have the legs in terms of angles in a similar, it's not going to be identical to a set position, but we're starting to get back towards a set position. You want to have the hips a fraction above the shoulders, but not way above the shoulders. So again, it's not fully replicant of that exact set position in a block, but we're starting to get back towards it. Again, with the tripod, it's a nice position to get the athlete starting to feel that ability to push from a crouched position. The other great thing with tripods, which I think is an underutilized skill, which I think we should all do as coaches, is actually get athletes to practice them off either leg, because this is the position that athletes will be put in when they come to 4x100 meter relays. And if you want a well-skilled athlete to be able to run any leg, they need to be able to start off their left leg or off their right leg for whatever specific leg it is they're running in the relay. So it's definitely something as coaches we should actively do within our training programs to make sure athletes can start off either legs. Because I know we've all coached relays, and how infuriating is it when you get an athlete goes, oh, I can't start off that leg. So instantly you either try and teach them how to do it, or they can only run a certain number of legs of that relay. So you want to have a highly skilled level of athlete so that if they come up to those kind of Welsh international levels and even onto British international levels, if they get into those environments and they can do a tripod start off of either leg, they're going to be in a much better place than lots of other athletes straight away. So definitely a skill to learn. Hold on, I'll just play this one more time. Yeah. And again, the movement pattern, I think if you look at the movement pattern for the drop-in, the rollover, and now the tripod, in terms of what we're doing after the start, it's pretty much exactly the same movement pattern. There's a very big thigh drive. It's a piston action. It's not taking lots of little steps. There's very good kind of push and hit off of each step. So that's what we don't want to see, too many deviations between start positions. We want the movement pattern after the start to be exactly the same. And then this one, I think personally, I would be tempted with youth athletes to teach a 4-point start prior to teaching a 3-point start. I probably should have put them that way around in the training, in this kind of video, because the problem that some of the younger athletes may have with a tripod start is holding their body weight on just one hand. Some of the youngsters may not have the upper body strength to be able to do multiple starts where they do just have one hand down, and it does take a little bit more coordination to do a tripod start than it does to do a 4-point start. So I would be kind of tempted to teach the 4-point start prior to a tripod. And I'll play this through a couple of times. do one more. Cool. Now, the reason I think, as I said, that a young developing athlete will find this slightly easier is that they've got 4 points of contact to the ground to be able to support their body weight. So that is a good starting point. So can anybody see a slight difference straight away there than the tripod start?
Hips are higher.
Hips are slightly higher. So all of a sudden those hips are slightly above the shoulders. And what that allows us to do is get more engagement around the hips. What you don't want to see, you don't want to see them way up so the shoulders are right down here, but you'd probably just want the hips a fraction higher than the shoulders in a 4-point start than you do in a 3-point start. But what I do see there is a very well balanced position. She looks very stable. She looks very strong. If I went over and kind of nudged her, she'd be pretty strong. And that's what we want to see. We don't want to see athletes shifting their body weight too far forward over their hands, because also kids are not going to like that, because their hands and their fingers and their thumbs are going to be killing them by the end of the session. You want to have their shoulders pretty much directly above their hands, because that'll allow them to distribute the weight evenly around their kind of 4 points of support. And again, it's a very strong position to push off from. Again, I'll just play this one again. And then obviously the final one will be a block start. I apologize for the quality in this video. It's gone a bit grainy. And this was a horrible day as well. So you can do blocks in Wales when it's raining. I think this one goes into a slow motion. So again, I'll run that back. A similar position, Hannah has just started to push there, but a similar position to what we saw in the 4-point, in that those hips are slightly above the shoulders. Very good feet engagement with the block pedals, and the shoulders directly above the hands, so that she's not shifting her weight too far forward. And then the movement pattern again is exactly the same as what we saw on all of the other accelerations. A very big thigh drive, a big split of the thighs, and switching them very, very quickly. Play again. There we go. So a big thigh drive, big split. So we see this piston action of the thighs popping back and forth. Again, just some nice shapes that we want to be seeing through the acceleration phase. And a big thing for myself as a coach with all of these positions and shapes is it allows us to teach acceleration. And I think that is the key factor for any youth athlete. They should know how to accelerate from a variety of positions, because if they know how to accelerate from a variety of positions, once you introduce the blocks, they know what they're meant to be doing after that. So that ability to accelerate properly is already there. If we introduce blocks too soon without the ability to accelerate, then it's all going to get very confusing. So I would always teach these progressions and the acceleration pattern prior to ever getting an athlete actually into the blocks and learning how to use the blocks. I think I've just stolen a lot of that. So yeah, just some of the benefits of these varied positions. Like I spoke about, it allows that transfer of the body weight to get those young athletes feeling that falling movement and pushing from that. By doing the drop in and then the rollover, you're progressing that movement, you're progressing the feeling of falling into where we want it to be eventually, which is in the blocks. But I think by doing those ones early, it allows that. If you can do a varied start, if you can do a drop in, a rollover, a tripod off of either leg, you're going to have a much more coordinated athlete. So when you do introduce the blocks, their body, their understanding of what their body is doing in space is going to be greater. They'll also have much more of an ability to apply force. Acceleration is all about applying force in the appropriate direction. It's not necessarily just about how fast you can move your arms and legs. You've actually got to be putting force into the ground in the right direction. And also with some of these things is it allows us to do good acceleration work all year round. We are lucky now that we have indoor facilities. There's indoor facilities west, north, and south. So we can do specific acceleration work all year. But even if you are outside, things like drop-in starts in October and November are a great way to do early acceleration work through the year. And for me as a coach as well, I've seen how many Welsh athletes over the last few years have gained British opportunities because of relays. Probably the way the sport is going in this country, we're now understanding that the best way to win medals is in relays, because we not necessarily have some of the freak talents that you get in Jamaica and places like that. So the higher relay skill development and the more tripod type work that we can do with the young athletes as they get to 18, 19, 20, and they might get Welsh International Honours and potentially onto GB Honours. We've had athletes selected onto those teams just because of the relay skill work that they have done. And when they go into British camps, the feedback that we always get is that the Welsh athletes are very well drilled, very well skilled because of things like being able to do, as I said, tripod starts and all of those things. As it says at the bottom there, and I said it earlier, when you have a youth athlete that can do all 4 of those start positions well, then all of a sudden they have the toolkit to know what to do when they get into blocks. They know how to accelerate. They know how to transfer their body weight. They'll be able to hold themselves in that set position stably and strong. And you know as a coach then that you're not going to have to spend hours and hours and hours on just teaching them how to kind of hold themselves in set, because all of that work will have already been done. And you can just get into the nitty-gritty stuff then of teaching them how to project out of the blocks and what we want to be doing on those first few steps. Sorry, I felt that was me talking very fast, very quickly through a lot of those slides. Has anyone got any questions or thoughts or kind of differing thoughts on what they found working with youngsters that they found has worked well, or just any thoughts on that? I've stunned you all into silence.
You tend to find that it comes from a lot of the time with youngsters, Matt, the parents. Over the years when I've been coaching, you'll go, why isn't little Johnny in blocks yet when everybody else is? And then you spend a lot of time explaining, the whys and don'ts of putting them into blocks too young. But that I've come across a lot is the pressure from parents. They see other athletes doing it and they go, well, why isn't my son or daughter using blocks yet?
Yeah, it is a tricky one, because we all know that the parents often like to buy a set of blocks for their youngster that they can use and things, and I think it's not a case of saying, right, we're not going to use blocks, but it's just, as you say, it's just trying to involve that parent in the process of going, yes, we will use blocks eventually, but I need the athlete to go through these progressions before we do that. You don't see junior tennis players playing with senior rackets. Like they use youth development rackets because of the weight of it and so on and so forth. We have to try and convey some of those things to the parents, that actually we need the athlete just to be able to support their body weight first, and learn how to push from the ground before we start. Because how often do you see when you get a 13-year-old into blocks that they don't even put their foot into the block to play anyway? Right?
Yeah. And that's one of the things I try to teach. I try to get them to push, and that's one of the things that I find with any start is get them to feel the push. Yeah. Because if they can't push, they're not going to be able to do it in blocks or any other type of start.
Exactly. And that's where then if we get them starting from a lot of varied positions, they will start understanding that feeling of pushing against the ground, and how we then bring that into that block setting. I am quite aware now we've only got 5 minutes or 4 minutes until the next session. If you guys have any questions, email them over to me and we can have a chat, or I can pick up the phone and we can have a chat about things.